A new round of negotiations, many new rounds of rocket fire. Death tolls are rising and violence is escalating in the Middle East. This is Special Report. Good evening, I'm Brett Baer. We're now 2 weeks into the conflict between Israel and Hamas, and death tolls are climbing quickly. Today, President Obama called for a ceasefire and sent his top diplomat to Egypt to do whatever he can. We'll talk about the situation more with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu shortly. But first, correspondent Connor Powell brings us the latest from Gaza City tonight.
At Gaza's Shifa hospital, a non-stop cycle is repeating itself. The injured are rushed in, while the dead are carried out to be buried. The past 36 hours have been especially costly to both Israelis and Palestinians, and the violence only grows. Health officials say more than 570 Palestinians have been killed, many of them civilians.
Without any alarming, they are bombing us at the midnight, 2 a.m. We are not related to any military works or any political activation.
Still, Israeli officials say they have warned civilians to leave the areas of operations, but those warnings are ignored. The 2-week conflict is taxing humanitarian groups. The United Nations estimates more than 81,000 civilians have fled their homes and taken shelter in UN camps north of Gaza.
As the number of refugees have grown the past few days with intense fighting, basic things like food and water are becoming more difficult. Fights breaking out here at a UN camp just for water.
Israel's military continued locating and destroying Hamas's vast tunnel and bunker system. The military says they've struck some 2,800 targets across Gaza. But so far, the operation has failed to silence Hamas's rockets. Today, more than 100 rockets were fired towards Israel, and Israeli forces clashed with Hamas gunmen who infiltrated into Israel via tunnels wearing Israeli military uniforms. Hamas said at least 10 of its fighters were killed, but still claimed it as a victory. Israeli soldiers were also killed as well in the clash.
We are slowly but gradually reducing the rocket threat on Israel. This is a difficult campaign. It's a long campaign, but we are determined and we are dealing with all the problems.
Israel vows to continue the operation until all of its goals are met, while Hamas says it will turn Gaza into a graveyard for Israeli troops. Because of this growing humanitarian crisis, the State Department announcing today that it is providing $47 million in aid and relief to Gaza. But more than anything, Brett, this area, both Gaza and Israel, it needs a ceasefire.
Connor Powell live in Gaza City early Tuesday morning. Connor, thank you. Stay tuned for my interviews with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Mustafa Barghouti of the Palestinian National Initiative Party. Now to another war zone, Ukraine, where international teams trying to investigate that downed plane made some progress today. Finally, the plane's black boxes and the victims' bodies are on the move. But many issues remain, including holding Russia's feet to the fire. Correspondent Steve Harrigan reports from Donetsk.
Tanks controlled by Russian-backed rebels rolled into battle against Ukrainian government forces in Donetsk today, just 40 miles from the crash site. The sounds of Grad rockets and sniper fire sent some families on the run with suitcases and pets. But the renewed fighting did not prevent the first steps of returning the remains of those killed on Malaysian Flight 17 to their families. Malaysia's Prime Minister announced he reached an agreement with the leader of the Russian-backed rebels to receive the plane's black boxes, the flight data recorders. And refrigerated train cars holding 281 bodies pulled out from rebel-controlled Terez headed north out of the war zone. Then they will be flown to the Netherlands for DNA testing. Though the bodies are gone, the scars they left behind in several villages here remain. Andrei Petrovich found one in his backyard. The image brings the 78-year-old to tears. I've been through the war with the Germans, famine, he says, but this is worse. A child was found near his front yard, number 28. Nadia's cell phone is filled with pictures of the dead from her yard, her street. her child's school. After the explosion, we ran out to see what happened, she says, and they were falling everywhere. Alone, here and gone, in sunflower fields, wheat fields, marked with a rag or a ribbon. The Netherlands is calling for a complete forensic investigation of the entire crash site. With fighting in the area like we saw today, that's going to be a real challenge. Brett?
Steve Harrigan live in Donetsk. Steve, thank you. Now to Chief White House correspondent Ed Henry with the big picture and how the Obama administration is responding to both major stories.
After flying all through the night, Secretary of State John Kerry arrived in Cairo with an urgent mandate from President Obama, who again said Israel has a right to defend itself, but added he's getting increasingly concerned about the rising number of Palestinian civilian deaths.
It now has to be our focus and the focus of the international community to bring about a ceasefire that ends the fighting and that can stop the deaths of innocent civilians, both in Gaza and in Israel.
The president quickly added brokering a ceasefire will not be easy, especially since former Israeli ambassador to the U.S. Michael Oren said Monday Kerry had not been invited by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and was coming, quote, to our chagrin, though Oren insisted he did not mean Kerry should stay away.
He supports Secretary Kerry going now and intervening, or does he want more time?
Well, you'd have to check with Prime Minister Netanyahu specifically about that.
As for the investigation into the downed jetliner in Ukraine, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power, continued to be more aggressive than the president.
If Russia is not part of the solution, it will continue to be part of the problem.
Her comments came as the United Nations Security Council debated a resolution calling for a thorough investigation after fiery comments from Russian President Vladimir Putin blaming the tragedy on Ukraine allegedly renewing violence in late June.
Nobody should or does have a right to use this tragedy to achieve their own selfish political objectives.
While the president demanded Putin do more to stop the separatists from removing evidence.
All of which begs the question, what exactly are they trying to hide?
Republicans charge the president's threats and previous sanctions have done little to change Putin's behavior.
Now's the time to step it up, to go back and say, listen, we're going to re-engage with the missile defense system in Poland and the Czech Republic. We're going to conduct joint military operations the way we used to do in Germany in Poland, right near the Russian sphere of influence.
As the president gets ready tomorrow to embark on 3 days of fundraising on the West Coast, including 6 campaign-related events for Democrats across 3 cities, plus an appearance on Jimmy Kimmel's late-night talk show, his aides brushed off the idea that addressing the Ukrainian crisis last week in between a visit to the charcoal pit in Delaware and fundraising in New York City was a problem.
The president had all the tools at his disposal that were necessary to fulfill the responsibilities of the commander-in-chief.
Tonight, top aides say the president is still planning to go ahead with the fundraising. He'll stay in close touch with his national security team from the road, though they note if these crises get worse and he's needed back here, the schedule may change. Brett?
Ed Henry live on the North Lawn. Ed, thank you. Up next, my interviews with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, an official from the Palestinian National Initiative Party. First, here's what some of our Fox affiliates across the country are covering tonight. WFXT in Boston, with the jury finding the friend of a Boston Marathon bombing suspect guilty on 2 counts. Azmat Tazayakov was found guilty of obstruction of justice and conspiracy for removing a backpack from Johar Tsarnaev's dorm room in the days following those bombings. Fox 6 in Milwaukee covering the crash of 2 freight trains in southeastern Wisconsin last night. 2 people were hurt. Thousands of gallons of diesel spilled. About 100 people who were evacuated have since been allowed to return home. And this is a live look outside Chicago from WFLD. The big story there tonight, a bad crash that has shut down Interstate 55. 4 people died, 3 others were hurt in a multi-vehicle crash involving 2 semis. That's tonight's live look outside the Beltway from Special Report. We'll be right back.